Okay, wonderful. So welcome everyone. Yeah, I'm very excited to share, especially the 2020 View on Women poll. So the VOW poll, or View on Women poll, is the only of its kind, I believe, in the world, where we singularly in one place look at social perceptions towards women, women in the workplace, which is what I'm going to talk about today, but also the poll examined women in the home, in policies and in politics, in terms of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. The national poll, which was conducted in 2020, was of 3,500 US adults ages 18 and older. This is a random sample, and it was both online and anonymous. In the poll, there's about 56 questions, and they really focus primarily on implicit bias, which is basically those biases that we hold that we may or may not be so aware of, but we really have a potentially serious implication on how we behave and how we see others. So again, today I'm gonna focus on just a few of the questions that relate to women in the workplace, mostly to introduce you to these questions, some summary kinds of responses, and really just to kick off a larger conversation about these issues. So we'll start with the first slide. Okay, so this question is not really an implicit bias question per se. So we asked the participants that we provided the statement, these days there's very little discrimination against working women that prevents them from getting the best jobs or promotions. And so what we have is about 42% of the people say, yes, there really is no, I mean, this is kind of a double negative, but that there isn't discrimination against women. A little bit higher for males and for females. So again, this isn't necessarily an implicit bias question, but it's a very good way to sort of start and frame the rest of the conversation. Because the fact is empirically, we know that there is tremendous discrimination against women that prevent them from working. And so when you ask people, is there discrimination? And we have a pretty large number of people who feel there isn't, it really provides us with some kind of an important framework for understanding some of the barriers that we have in the workplace. And also it provides an interesting framework because the same people who answered, many of them answering no to this one, we'll see how they answer to some of the other questions. So if we move to the next slide. So the next slide, we asked specifically which they prefer at work, a male supervisor. It also said a female supervisor or neither. In this case, if there really was no discrimination, we would hope that everybody would say neither, right? It doesn't matter if the supervisor is male or female. But here we have, it's not a large amount, but here we have about 17% of our US population still saying that they prefer a male supervisor, and a little bit higher, 21%. So that's 1 out of 5 men still arguing that they would prefer to have a male supervisor at work. So then we'll move to the next slide. Now we're getting a little bit deeper into these implicit bias challenges. So the question was, a mother must put her young child ahead of her career. How much people agreed with that. So here we have half of our US population, male and female, feeling that a mother should put her young child ahead of her career. I'm going to move to the next slide. I'm going to group all of these together in a minute. And then we ask, is it harder for women, mothers who work outside the home, to establish a warm, secure relationship with their children? And it's a little bit less, but 33%, so that's 1/3 of the people, the adults in the United States, are feeling that these mothers who work outside the home are not having a strong, healthy relationship with their children. So now let's just pause here for a second and think about what this all means in terms of the implications of it. So we have this general sense that there's not any discrimination, or there's, about half our people feel there's not significant discrimination against women. We still have a small group of people who are saying they prefer a male supervisor, But these last two questions about the capacity for women to have good relationships with their children, and also the perception that people would have of these women who are working, who may be working full time and have children at home, how are their coworkers thinking about them? Are they thinking less of them because they are really, if women who are really focused on moving ahead and advancing themselves professionally, are they somehow damaging their children? And how are these women thinking about themselves and making decisions about whether to go for that promotion or to try to do more if she feels that she might be damaging her children by doing this? And what makes this kind of even more interesting is if we move to the next slide, about 30% of Americans, of those who are sampled, would actually prefer that the household income would be lower than to have the father be the one who gives up. So the statement was, in a family, if the father's pay is lower than that of a mother, he is the one who should give up work and look after the children. And here we have about 30% of Americans disagreeing with this. So suggesting that the father should not be the one who primarily takes care of the kid, even if he's making less money. So again, it would be better for the household to have a lower household income than to have the father necessarily be the one taking care of the children. And interestingly, we have the females who are slightly higher disagreeing with this idea that the father should be the one who stays home than males. We'll move to the next slide, please. So there were also a few questions that related to women and race in the workplace. And so I'm providing one example here. So it was a statement of, it's important for women of color to conform to white ideals of beauty in the workplace. And so here we have overall about 18% agree with this statement. And then if I divided it by race, we have about a quarter of Blacks saying that they agree to this, and 20% of Hispanics. So now this is kind of interesting because I already told you this whole survey was about implicit bias. But what's interesting about this question is, in my interpretation of it, those people who are white who answer that they agree with this are expressing their implicit bias. But those people of color who are answering this, particularly the women of color who are answering this, are more likely describing their real experience, their real lived experience. So it is not necessarily their implicit bias for women of color or people of color, but for people who are white, it absolutely is. And it's a really important thing because it again speaks to how implicit bias feeds this underlying current that is felt by women and women of color while they're trying to succeed in the workplace. And, when we expect conformity, we show it. If somebody showed up new at your work and they had piercings all over it, your body, your face would somehow reflect that they went against the conformed ideas, assuming that that's not the typical work style. Most likely in corporate America, that isn't. And so again, we're setting, if we set this unspoken expectation that white ideals of beauty are what people should have, then when we don't see that, we're going to create an environment, even if we don't realize it, that can be uncomfortable. And now I'll move to the next slide. There were also several questions that looked at sexual harassment in the workplace. This was a really important thing for me because, as Lee mentioned, I did this study initially in New York as a pilot, but it focused on New York in 2017. Between 2017 and 2020, even though it's only been 3 years, a lot has happened, especially in relationship to sexual harassment. We've seen the whole Women's March, we've seen the Me Too movement. And so it seemed, and in conversations that I know I've had and plenty of other people have had, when we're talking about issues of sexual harassment, are these concepts, this idea that sexual harassment is something that's vague, which I don't agree with. I think that what sexual harassment is quite clear, but that's an opportunity to essentially, in many ways, blame the victim. but what's interesting is, many of my questions are purposefully rather provocative in that sometimes I'm more subtle at trying to get at implicit biases, and sometimes I'm less. I would feel this is an example of being less subtle, that stating with the statement, hiring an attractive woman increases the chances of sexual harassment in the workplace. You would think that anyone who is aware of what's going on in the world would recognize that this is ridiculous, that how attractive a woman isn't the cause of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is the part of the person who's doing the harassing. And yet 33% or one third of Americans feel that the attractive woman is going to increase the sexual harassment. Still just over a quarter of females and almost 40% of men are carrying these beliefs. So in combination with how we're implicitly thinking about women who are trying to succeed at work while they have children at home, women of color who are being expected to conform to some look, or else they are considered outsiders, and this idea that essentially violence or negative behavior in that workplace is somehow the fault of the individual who's receiving that harassment, as opposed to the fault of the people who are delivering it. And so we can see that all of these together are creating this potential hostile and negative environment. It counters very much this idea that there is no discrimination happening for women that keeps them from succeeding. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Lee.